Shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I'll give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. At COP29, an additional 6 nations endorsed the declaration to triple nuclear energy by 2050. They joined 25 others, including the United States, UK, Canada, Czech Republic, Finland, France, Japan, Republic of Korea, Moldova, Mongolia, Morocco, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Sweden, Ukraine, the UAE, some with existing civil nuclear programs and others committing to a program so that they can reduce emissions and deliver energy at a reasonable cost. Why isn't the Albanese government signing up to the same agreement?
No. Order. The Acting Prime Minister will. The Leader can resume his seat. The member for Spence was interjecting all through that answer. He will leave the chamber under 94A. And how much clearer I need to make it about members being heard in silence when questions are being asked. The same thing will happen if this continues. The Leader has asked his question in silence. He deserves that courtesy. Now the Acting Prime Minister deserves the same courtesy. He has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and there's a very simple answer to that question, because we don't have a civil nuclear energy establishment in this country, and nor do we seek to establish one. And the reason we don't seek to establish one, Mr Speaker, is because to do so would be to pursue the single most expensive form of electricity in the world today. That would be an additional $1,200 on the energy bill of every household in this country. That's what it would represent. That's what it would represent to go down the path of a civil nuclear industry. We don't have one. We don't seek to go down that path, so we are not a part of that agreement. And if we did go down that path, as the Leader of the Opposition is suggesting, there would be no prospect of any piece of electricity entering into the grid for 2 decades. And even then, what we're talking about is at max 4% of the electricity grid being contributed in 20 years' time. The most expensive form of electricity, $1,200 per household in 20 years' time, and even then it's only 4% of the grid. That's what the ridiculous proposal that is being put forward by the Leader of the Opposition represents. But I tell you what we did sign up to, Mr Speaker, at COP28 last year in the UAE with 132 other countries, including the United Kingdom, including the United States, including France and others, was a commitment to triple the world's renewable energy capacity. Because we understand that the cheapest form of electricity in the world today is firmed renewable energy. And that is what's being pursued by countries around the world. And that is what we're pursuing here, not in 20 years' time, Mr Speaker, but right now, such that we have seen a 25% increase of firmed renewables into our grid since we came to office. Now, that is actually making a difference in putting downward pressure on energy prices, along with the energy price relief that we have put in place, which those opposite have blocked not once but twice. So on this side of the House, we represent pursuing efficient energy which seeks to transition us to a place of zero net emissions by 2050, such that we take our country to the cutting edge of technological modernity. Those opposite are about going backwards, about increasing energy prices and about pursuing a fool's errand.
There's far too much noise during that answer. The member for O'Connor, the member for Barker were interjecting. Just going to ask them to dial it down so I can hear from the member for Chisholm.
Thank you so much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. How are the Albanese Labor government's policies supporting progress to close the gender pay gap, and what are the alternative approaches?
Give the call to the Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Chisholm for the question. She is someone who has spent her entire working life championing the cause of Australia's women. This government is determined to improve the economic security and equality of women in this country, and every day we have been working to close the gender pay gap to make the lives of Australian women fairer and more equal. And today, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency released its latest gender equality scorecard, and it's good news. The scorecard shows the gender pay gap is the lowest it has been since reporting first started in 2014. And the main driver of the decrease in the gender pay gap is a lift in wages for lower-paid workers, especially in highly feminised sectors. They are Labor policies that is driving this change. We have increased transparency for gender pay gap reporting. We're investing in wage increases in aged care and early childhood education and care. This is the workforce that, alongside educating our smallest children, is actually also literally the workforce that enables all of us and all of the workforce in the country to do the jobs that we do. They are an incredibly important workforce. People like my sister, who after raising 6 kids on her own, went back into childcare for Knox Council and spent decades raising children in her care. We've supported lifting the minimum wage. We've made gender equality an object of the Fair Work Act, and we've strengthened protections against sexual harassment in the workforce. Many of these measures were opposed, frankly, by those opposite, and that is really a shame on them. Under Labor, the gender pay gap has dropped to record levels. Under Labor, women's average weekly earnings have increased to $173.80 a week since May 2022. That is a substantial increase. And under Labor, we've reached record highs in women's economic participation. And while progress has been strong, Labor is not going to stop doing the hard work to close the gender pay gap. Today, of course, the Assistant Minister has introduced legislation requiring big companies to set gender equality targets for their workplaces, something that, again, will make a significant difference. But none of this would have happened if those opposite had continued to be in government and they had their way. If we continued on the path that they set the country down, the gender pay gap would be closing 3 times slower than it is under us. Now, that has real consequences for the wages of Australian women, real consequences for the economic security of women in this country. We know the Leader of the Opposition, his policies have real costs. Real costs. He has the wrong agenda for Australia and the wrong agenda for Australia's women.
Call to the member for Fairfax.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Given global momentum for nuclear energy, along with support from the world's largest banks, including Bank of America, Barclays, Brookfield, Citi, Credit, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Rothschild and Co.
The member's going to pause. We're going to take as long as we need to do this. The Minister for the Environment is now warned. It's really simple. People are going to ask their questions in silence. We'll stop question time to enable that to happen, which means there could be less questions. I don't think anyone wants that. So, the member for Fairfax will begin his question again.
To the Acting Prime Minister, given global momentum for nuclear energy, along with support from the world's largest banks, including Bank of America, Barclays, Brookfield, Citi, Credit, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Rothschild and Co., and leading tech companies like Google, Microsoft and Amazon, and even Young Labor, are calling for an end to Australia's nuclear ban, why does the Albanese government remain so stubbornly opposed to exploring this proven zero-emissions energy source?
Call to the order. We'll give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question. I mean, the answer is it's all about cost and it's all about economics. I mean, we don't have a civil nuclear industry in Australia today. It is a significant fact, an inconvenient truth, which those opposite
The Acting Prime Minister is going to pause. I just made the point that when the member for Fairfax is being heard, I want everyone to be silent. So the answer to that question is not to start yelling straight away, particularly this close to me. So interject. If you must yell, don't do that. Order. Reset. The Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is a...
No. This is... Yeah, this is not what anyone wants, and I don't think the people of Australia want. So you'll leave the chamber under 94A. Just asking everyone to show some restraint and some respect. That's completely not on. The acting Prime Minister is going to be heard in silence.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, it was a ridiculous display befitting what is a ridiculous policy that is being put forward by those opposite. And it simply fails to ignore the inconvenient truth for those opposite that we don't have a civil nuclear industry in Australia today, and to establish one from scratch costs money and takes time. I mean, it's not that simple, although the Leader of the Opposition may think it's that simple because he thinks that the way it works is that you go off and burn uranium, that we go out the back, set up a bonfire, throw some uranium on it and bingo, there's renewable energy. But unfortunately, that's not how it actually works. And every expert out there makes it completely clear that what we are awaiting is a 20-year duration before we could reasonably expect to have nuclear energy in this country were we to go down that path. And even then, all we are talking about is a contribution of 4% to the electricity grid. But do all of that, and what you will achieve is the single most expensive form of electricity that this country could pursue, an increase of $1,200 onto the household budgets of every Australian. That's the idea. I mean, that is the idea which is being put forward by those opposite. Well, on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we reject that idea, and what we are pursuing is policies in the here and now, which are being pursued around the world. Firmed renewable energy, which is the cheapest form of energy which is being brought online around the world. And that's what we're doing right now, not in 20 years, but right now, such that since we've come to power, we've increased the grid by 25% in terms of its renewable capacity. So that is what we are doing, and it stands in stark contrast to the ridiculous antics that we see from those opposite.
Call to the honourable member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. How has the Albanese Labor government's multi-billion-dollar investment in pay rises for the aged care sector helped women in the workforce?
Great question. Call to the Minister for Aged Care and the Minister for Sport.
I thank the member for Corangamite for her question and for her personal commitment to improving the quality of care for older people in her beautiful part of the world. Mr Speaker, 85% of the aged care workforce are women, and for too long these women were undervalued and underappreciated for their highly skilled work because of a prejudicial bias ingrained in our society which said some work is simply worth less because of the type of people more inclined to do it, and that you should be paid more to stack supermarket shelves than you should be to pay to care for older Australians. And the Albanese Labor government made it a priority to offer more than thanks, more than platitudes, more than pats on the back, and we now have, as of today, definitive evidence that our $15.1 billion investment in the female-dominated aged care workforce has made a difference. This morning, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency published their latest gender equality scorecard, and it illustrated a confronting 21.1% gender pay gap, a 0.6% reduction from their last survey. However, the Gender Equality Agency said the main reason for that reduction was the 15% wage increase for residential aged care workers. And just yesterday we heard from Hester Superfund. They are now projecting that aged care workers will retire with $40,000 more in their superannuation as a result of the Albanese Labor government pay rises. And the benefits for aged care workers come from more than our record wage increases. Labor's tax cuts delivered registered nurses in aged care a $1,679 reduction in their tax, almost double what they would have received under the coalition. helping workers like Rachel, whom I met last week at a mobile office in Zilmere. We did that at Mickey's Cafe. Shout out to Mickey for his lemon biscuits. Rachel has been working at aged care for more than 7 years. Rachel told me that the Albanese government's pay rise has been transformative. She said that the lack of meaningful wage increases over a decade had left many workers like her at her nursing home driving vehicles well past their use-by date and needing extensive repairs. It was dangerous. And Rachel said she and many of her colleagues have now bought more reliable vehicles, which they could only afford to do so because of this pay rise. And these pay rises are helping our male aged care workers too. Rachel's colleague Ahmed, who has been saving for a deposit for a house for 8 years. The banks are now considering Ahmed for a home loan because of the pay rise that we were able to deliver for him, because of the value that the Albanese Labor government places on care.
Before I call the member for North Sydney, I just have a number of acknowledgements I'd like to do to welcome them to Parliament. I'm pleased to inform the House that present is a delegation from Tuvalu, led by the Honourable Paulson Panapa, Tuvalu Minister of Foreign Affairs, Labour and Trade. We're also joined by the Honourable John Huntsman Jr., former US Ambassador to Russia, China and Singapore, and the 16th Governor of Utah. I'm pleased to inform the House also we have the Honourable Lisa Neville, former member for Ballerine and Minister in the Victorian Parliament, Lake Macquarie City Councillor Madeline Bishop. I see representatives of Beef Australia, including the Chairman Bryce Cam, and also students from Merimbula Public State School in the electorate of the mighty Eden Monero. Welcome to you all. We give the call to the honourable member for North Sydney.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. At a time when Australians are struggling more than ever to keep up with their loan repayments, this government, with the likely support of the opposition, will soon pass a piece of legislation that will see the two major parties each receive nearly $5 million a year in public funding as administrative funding assistance. This money will be able to be used to pay interest payments on party loans. How does the government justify allowing public money to be used to pay the interest on political party loans when so many ordinary Australians are struggling?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for her question. I begin by acknowledging and saluting the terrific work of Minister Farrell, who has been working for some time in a consultative way to do what we can to make sure that our donations regime is as transparent as possible and that we take responsible and necessary steps to lessen the impact of big money on politics. Minister Farrell, in his characteristically diligent and consultative way, has provided to the Parliament, for the Parliament's consideration, some steps that we think are necessary and sensible to achieve those objectives, and we urge the Parliament to support them.
Call to the honourable member for Holt. The member for Holt. The member for Holt will resume her seat. Is the member for North Sydney seeking to make a point of order?
Please, Mr Speaker.
Well, the minister's concluded his answer.
But he had it when I stood up, Mr Speaker. You had your head down.
My apologies to the member for North Sydney. I didn't see her on her feet. Give the call to the honourable member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. What does the government's commitment to a 15% wage increase mean to the early childhood education and care workforce?
The call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education and the Minister for Youth.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I thank the member for Holt for her question and for her tireless advocacy for children and families in the electorate of Holt. Mr Speaker, the member for Holt understands that early childhood workers provide an essential service and that a sustainable and secure early childhood education and care workforce is a foundation. It's a foundation for a universal early childhood education system that's affordable, that's accessible and that's inclusive. Early childhood educators and teachers do highly skilled work and professional work, but for too long they haven't been valued, Mr Speaker. They just have not had the remuneration that reflects that professionalism. And because of this, for far too long, we've been losing workers from the sector. Now, I'm pleased to say that there are now around 30,000 more early childhood education workers than when we first came into office in 2022. And that is in no small measure due to the efforts of this government, not just to grow the workforce, but importantly to also properly value this highly feminised workforce. And a critical part of this is our historic 15% wage increase, an investment by the Albanese Labor government. 200,000 early childhood workers right across Australia could have another $100 at least more in their pay packets by Christmas this year. And by next year, that could be more than $150 in their pay packets. Mr Speaker, that's how you grow an essential workforce. That's how you ensure that children, that families and that communities have access to early childhood education. Now, it seems really just a no-brainer. Parents know this, early childhood educators know this, people in the sector know this, that to truly value the workforce, to keep the workforce, you need to pay them more. But not everyone in this place gets this. Not everyone in this place understands this. The Shadow Minister for Early Childhood Education said, and I quote,
Order. No, members on my the member for Gorton, Minister for Housing. Order. The Treasurer. No. People are entitled to raise points of order. We don't need commentary or sound effects when someone rises to their feet. That is not appropriate behaviour and it's not going to continue. The manager on a point of order.
On relevance, there was no reference in the question to alternative policies, to opposition or any of that. The minister is now straying into opposition policies and statements. She's not being relevant. She should be directed to be relevant. If she can't be, she should be asked to sit down.
The question was about what does the commitment to the 15% increase mean to early childhood and care workforce. So that's a very specific topic question. She wasn't asked about alternative approaches, so she can't talk about perhaps policy. She's got some commentary to make about the government's decision. That's different, but she simply can't use the remainder of her time to talk about opposition policy. If she does, I will sit her down. She has the call.
Mr Speaker, I am talking about the importance of this pay rise for the sector, for retaining the sector, and the fact that parents and early childhood educators support this, but that support is not universal in this place. That there are people in this place who have said that they think that it is a waste, that it is something that the budget can't afford, and that is a risk to those early childhood educators who are relying on that 15% wage rise to stay in the sector and to stay in doing the job that they love. Make no mistake, Mr Speaker, the essential services provided by early childhood educators would be at risk if we did not make
Call to the honourable for Page.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Can the Acting Prime Minister confirm whether on June 6, 2024, the Albanese Labor government, through the Minister for Trade, signed an agreement under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity that includes a cooperative work program to support the take-up of small modular nuclear reactors?
Order. Order. Members on the member for Durack. Members on my left will cease interjecting. Order. Until the House comes to order, we won't hear anything. The member for Page is not helping. The Acting Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, they crawl to this topic through every different alleyway, but let me be really clear. What I can absolutely confirm is that this government is not going to be pursuing a civil nuclear industry. And we're not going to be doing it because it would be the single most costly form of electricity that we could provide in this country.
The Acting Prime Minister completed his answer? Yeah. Order. We'll hear from the member for Reid.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government helping with the cost of living by getting wages moving again? How are other policies helping with the cost of living, and what barriers have there been?
Call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for her question. In meeting the cost of living challenge, a key objective of our government has been to get wages going, and we've been doing that by increasing the minimum wage and by seeing award increases in sectors like aged care and childcare, and this is now flowing through to the wider labour market such that we are now experiencing the strongest real wage growth in 4 years. Now, we get that Australians are doing it tough, and there is a lot more which needs to be done, but these extra dollars in the pay packet are making a real difference. And in particular, this is benefiting women, because these increases are occurring across the care economy, and as a result, the gender pay gap is now at its lowest level on record. Mr Speaker, we are also reducing costs. We're doing so through more affordable childcare, through cheaper medicines, through free TAFE. But the biggest risk to that, well, he is sitting right there. And, Mr Speaker, yesterday we got a crystal clear articulation of the philosophies of those opposite when the Deputy Leader of the Opposition said, and I quote, "It's a key principle and tenet of the Liberal Party, if you don't pay for something, you don't value it." Well, it's nothing if it isn't honest, because this was exactly demonstrated when the Leader of the Opposition was the Minister for Health, when he tried to introduce a GP tax, when he tried to put a cost on the attendance of emergency departments right around the country, when he sought to increase the prices of basic medicines. And what he did as the Minister for Health, if given the chance, he would do as the Prime Minister across the board. Well, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we have a very different philosophy, because we understand that Australians in their darkest hour who are receiving emergency care in emergency departments without charge, well, they do value that. And we understand that Australians who are undergoing life-saving surgery so that they can return to their families without a crippling debt.
Is going to cease interjecting. I can appreciate there might be some response included to what the Acting Prime Minister comes, but the member for Barker and you just continually running through commentary, it's not sustainable. So we're just going to dial it down. For the remainder of this answer, there's only 26 seconds. I'm setting everyone a challenge just to get through this answer. The Acting Prime Minister.
Without a crippling debt, and they value that too. On this side of the House, we are proud to stand as the party which has been the champion throughout our nation's history of public health and of public education, and we most certainly will take that philosophy to the next election, when Australians will be given a choice between a government which is fighting for them and a man who represents a material risk to the household budgets of every single Australian.
You call to the member for Hume.
Acting Prime Minister, Australia is at odds with every comparable economy and ally in rejecting zero-emissions nuclear energy, putting at risk energy security and energy costs. Can the Assistant Prime Minister confirm the reason Labor is rejecting nuclear power has nothing to do with cost or time, but because of their political battle with the Greens in inner-city seats?
We're going to do this again because I couldn't hear the question, because there were too many people on the right, on my right, interjecting. So the way question time works for those on my right is I need to hear the question, so that if a topic comes up or a point of order, I then have to make a decision on. So it makes my job really hard if I can't hear it. So we're going to do this again, and the member for Hume is going to have his question. And I don't need any commentary, otherwise people will leave and not hear the question. The member for Hume has the call.
Acting Prime Minister, Australia is at odds with every comparable economy and ally in rejecting zero-emissions nuclear energy, putting at risk energy security and electricity costs. Can the Acting Prime Minister confirm the reason Labor is rejecting nuclear power has nothing to do with cost or time, but because of their political battle with the Greens in inner-city seats?
Hear, hear.
Give it order. The Minister for Social Services is warned. Acting Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And yes, we do have a battle with the Greens political party, and we join that battle with relish, which really does stand in stark contrast to what we see from those opposite, who, when it comes to housing, the environment or now immigration, are in the greatest love affair of all time with the Greens political party. I mean, I think Romeo and Juliet teaches us that love conquers all, but I definitely do not think that Shakespeare imagined what was going on here. What we are seeing here is the most unholy alliance between the Greens and the Liberals. And so every Australian needs to know that when they go out and they vote for the Greens political party or when they vote for the Liberals, when it comes to Canberra, it is the one team. Now, what I can confirm, Mr Speaker, is that the simple reason why we are not supporting a civil nuclear industry is because it makes no financial sense whatsoever. And because it makes no financial sense is exactly why this shadow treasurer would be proposing it. Because he is the man who has refused to make any sense when as it comes to the economics of this country since he's taken up his post. Economic management certainly ain't his strong suit. But we certainly will not be pursuing a civil nuclear industry. It is $1,200 per household more expensive in 20 years' time, and at that point it's only going to contribute 4% to our electricity grid. So no, we are not walking down that road.
Give the call to the honourable member for Fraser.
My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese government's responsible budget and economic management right for the conditions we face? How does it compare internationally and to alternative approaches?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Fraser for the contribution that he makes to our economic policies on this side of the House. In an uncertain global environment, the hallmark of this Albanese Labor government has been responsible economic management, and that could never be more important than it is right now. From time to time, those opposite ask us to make international comparisons. The reason that's not happening today is because inflation went up in Canada overnight and it's going down in Australia. It's going up in the US and Canada and Europe, but it's coming down in Australia, and that's why he hasn't asked about inflation, Mr Speaker. But I look forward to 3 o'clock when he jumps up and asks his first question of me today, Mr Speaker. Now, another really important international comparison is when it comes to the budget position. Now, the IMF has made it clear when those opposite were in office, we had the 14th strongest budget analysed by the IMF, and now we're in the top 3. We've gone from 14th in 2021 under them to onto the podium in 2024 on our watch, Mr Speaker. And that's because we've knocked out a couple of budget surpluses, turned their big deficits into big surpluses, $172 billion turnaround, $150 billion less debt, $80 billion less in interest repayments, Mr Speaker. And here's where the international comparison is so stunning, Mr Speaker. We've got debt to GDP down from the mid-40s, peaking, to the mid-30s. Now, how does that compare with other countries? Mid-30s in Australia, United Kingdom 103, Canada 106, France 111, United States 123, Italy 139, Japan 251% of GDP. That's their debt compared to the mid-30s here in Australia. I'm asked about alternatives, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about alternatives, Mr Speaker. Now, I tried to give the Shadow Treasurer some help today. I tried to give him some help. I gave him more than 20 minutes to tell the parliament and to tell the Australian people what he would do differently when it comes to the economy. And instead, Mr Speaker, we learned exactly why. His colleagues are in the Saturday paper saying that he's got no direction, he's vacated the field and he just throw rocks. Instead of getting coherent and credible, costed economic policies, we just got this kind of bizarre cut and paste of his least coherent interview transcripts, Mr Speaker. And the reason this matters so much to this parliament and to this country is because we know that those opposite are a risk to our economy and our budget, because we know their record. When they were in office, inflation was much higher. Real wages were falling. They went after Medicare, Mr Speaker. They delivered deficit after deficit and $1 trillion in Liberal debt in a budget chock full of waste and rorts. Now, we have spent the best part of our term in office cleaning up the mess that they left us. We made good progress, but they know there's more work to do. The worst thing we could do is go back to the comical incompetence of the Shadow Treasurer.
The call to the honourable member for Mallee. The member for O'Connor is warned.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. Australians are suffering with higher rents and an inability to find housing. Under the Albanese Labor government's Big Australia policy, a new person is arriving to live in our country every 44 seconds. Minister, where are these new people supposed to live?
Talk to the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Homelessness.
Well, thank you, Speaker. And let me just make a few comments off the top about the migration matters that have been raised here. Speaker, migration is coming down because of changes that have been made by our government. And we've done this in a system that Dr Martin Parkinson has described as fundamentally broken by a decade of willful neglect. And if there is a single person in this parliament who is responsible for that broken system, he sits over here in the opposition leader's chair, Speaker. The Minister for Home Affairs talked yesterday about the fact that there is one gold medal in this parliament for the person who issued the most number of visas in a single year. It wasn't a Labor minister, Speaker. It was the Leader of the Opposition who talks a big game. He talks a big game about migration, but we learned something very important about him this week. We learnt that he is an absolute fraud, because when it came the chance to address some of the issues that the honourable member has asked me about, the Leader of the Opposition, instead of doing the right thing and helping us take action, went absolutely to...
The Minister will pause. Take a seat for a sec. We'll hear from the member for Deakin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Point of order is on relevance. We're a minute into the answer, and the minister has not once referred to the question or the fact that migrants arriving every 44 seconds.
Order. The member for Swan is warned. The Leader of the House.
The preamble of the question opened up a discussion of the policy really clearly, and that's exactly what the minister is now engaging in. They might not like for that information to be returned, but it's completely relevant to what was asked.
It is directly relevant, but that can't be the consistency of the minister's remaining answer. So, to assist with the member's question, I'm going to invite her to return to the question. She has had a preamble. She's had a minute into the question.
I was asked about migration, Speaker. I was also asked about housing, so I'm happy to move to that. I'll move to that.
I haven't finished speaking.
Okay.
So before you take off, just if you could assist me to do my job, I can assist you to do your job. So if you could just remain silent just while I assist the House, so everyone order. So whilst you're entitled to go through that, to assist the member's question, I'm just going to ask you to return back to the question. The Minister has the call.
Speaker, let me say a few things about our government's housing policy. Speaker, we arrived in office 2.5 years ago to find housing in an absolute mess. Speaker, let's remember that for most of the period of time that those opposite were in government, they didn't even have a Commonwealth Housing Minister. Speaker, they do not have a leg to stand on. Now, we've taken a very different approach. Our country today is led by a Prime Minister who was raised in public housing. His access to public housing as a child transformed the entire trajectory of his life. Those opposite don't like to hear it much, but the fact that we have a person who was raised in public housing as our Prime Minister, I think is a fact that every Australian should be proud of, Speaker. Now, we want to offer this opportunity of secure housing to as many people as we can. We've got a housing crisis in our country that's been cooking for 30 years, and we are the boldest and most ambitious Commonwealth in that period to come forward and say we want to help Australians address this need. One of the main things that we are doing about this, Speaker, is working with the states and territories to build more homes. We are trying to work with the states and territories to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. We're working with renters to make sure that they've got better rental rights, and we are trying to get more Australians into that dream of home ownership. Now, if only, Speaker, we had a parliament that actually wanted to work with us on this issue that affects millions of people. Instead, what we have is an opposition that knows only one word, no, 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 to every single proposition that's put forward. And unfortunately, people on the crossbench, the Australian Greens, who talk a big game about housing, but when it comes time to make real change for real people, they say no too. So who would have thought the far left and the far right had so much in common in this country? Despite that opposition, we will work hard to make sure that we meet the housing needs of people in this country.
Hear, hear. Call to the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Education. Why is it important to strengthen integrity in the international education system, and what is standing in the way?
The call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the real deal member for Robertson, for his question. Yesterday I told the House about the shonks and the crooks who feed off our international education system, exploiting students to make a quick buck here in Australia.
Order.
And it's why this government is acting to protect the integrity of this sector after these problems were allowed to fester by the previous Liberal government. In September 2022, we set up the Parkinson Review into our migration system. And in January of 2023, we set up the Nixon Review into the exploitation of Australia's visa system. And it made this very serious point. There can be much profit to gain from those who choose to engage in the provision of immigration assistance that aids illegal sex work, human trafficking, modern slavery and money laundering. These reviews exposed the need to act to protect the integrity of our international education system, and we've moved quickly to act on the recommendations of those two reviews. In July last year, we got rid of the Liberals' unlimited work rights for international students. In August last year, I closed the loophole that allowed dodgy agents and providers to shift international students from genuine study to no study at all, just using the system as a backdoor to work here. In October last year, we created a $38 million integrity unit to crack down on the shonks and the crooks. In March this year, we increased the English language requirement for international students. In May, we increased the amount of money that international students need to bring with them to get a student visa. And in July, we doubled the visa application charge. But that's not all that we're doing. The legislation that's in the parliament at the moment doesn't just set up a cap on the number of international students that can come to this country in any year. The bill that is currently before the Senate, that the Liberal Party and the Greens are in bed together stopping, also does this. It prevents education providers from owning an education agent business. It requires providers to educate Aussie students for 2 years before they're allowed to recruit international students, and it prevents providers who are under serious regulatory investigation from recruiting new international students. This is what the Liberal Party is planning to vote against. I wonder why.
Order. We'll hear from the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Speaker. Question to the Infrastructure Minister. The business case for the Middle Arm Hub has been rejected. The environmental impact statement has been delayed. The cost has ballooned to $3.5 billion, $2 billion more than first committed. This climate-wrecking project survives on your $1.5 billion subsidy and the enthusiasm of Labor ministers for these gas companies. Will you do the right thing and redirect this toxic funding to support clean energy projects that will actually benefit our communities?
Give the call to the member for Riverina. Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government has the call.
Well, there's a lot to correct in that question, and let me start by saying, the Greens never mention the 65 renewable energy projects that this government has approved. Never. You absolutely ignore them as though they don't exist at all, because it doesn't suit your political interests to acknowledge the good job that the Minister for Environment has done in increasing renewable energy in this country. Now, when it comes, of course, to Middle Arm, let me just remind the House that this is an equity injection. It is not money that then can be transferred to other projects. Just let me educate you about that. It is an equity injection. And that equity injection provides the opportunity for the first time for the Northern Territory to actually have an industrial precinct, which does include renewable energy projects like Sun Cable, that actually provides the opportunity for the Northern Territory to begin to increase its revenue so it can become more self-reliant, rather than having to rely, as it does, largely on the federal government to fund its services, particularly services in First Nations communities. Now, I would have thought that anybody would be thinking it would be in Australia's interest for the Northern Territory to be able to stand economically on its own feet, to be able to be part of the generation that we are seeing of renewable energy, and making sure that we actually have those jobs into the future for people who live in the Northern Territory. Now, the Australian government remains committed to Middle Arm. There are a number of processes that have to be gone through the environmental processes, through planning processes as well, through Infrastructure Australia, and all of those are underway at the moment, and I look forward to working with the Northern Territory government to make sure we can secure the economic future for the Northern Territory. But again, I say to the Greens, stop using politics constantly in these sorts of debates. Stop using politics, because we know that Middle Arm actually does support renewable energy. It does support renewable energy, and it also makes sure that we have a strong economic future for the Northern Territory, and we stand by Labor's commitment, Labor's record investment in renewable energy and the approval of renewable energy projects. And I look forward to the Minister for Environment getting a question about the record number of approvals for renewable energy we have done.
Call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Minister, how will the Albanese Labor government's legislation to keep the national broadband network in public ownership deliver better broadband and affordable prices for Australian families and, in particular, regional communities? And, Minister, are there any alternative approaches?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. Labor, of course, founded the National Broadband Network to deliver fast, reliable and affordable broadband to all Australians. It's an essential piece of national infrastructure that connects millions of Australians, irrespective of where they live or work. The Albanese government has made significant investments in fibre and fixed wireless upgrades, delivering improvements for Australians. Now, when we came to government, less than 300,000 premises had a pathway to upgrade from copper to full fibre. Today, that figure is 4 million. On the fixed wireless network, we've upgraded over 2,300 towers, boosting average user download speeds by 133%. We've also uncapped satellite broadband plans, delivering educational benefits to students in regional and remote communities. Mr Speaker, public ownership is delivering big public benefits when it comes to the NBN. In contrast, when state Liberal governments sold off electricity assets, consumer prices rose 3 times faster than other services. Yet today, the Liberals and Nationals voted against the government's legislation to secure the NBN in public ownership. Mr Speaker, those opposite want publicly owned nuclear reactors, but they don't want a publicly owned NBN. They're prepared to sell off public assets to pay for their irresponsible and unfunded nuclear policy
Order.
and the broadband pushovers in the National Party
Order.
will let them do it, just like when they flogged off Telstra. So, Mr Speaker, for consumers, what does that mean? It means higher prices, reduced services and cuts to investments, especially in the regions. Now, Mr Speaker, it's important for the House to understand what those opposite tried to get away with in their dying days of government. They wanted to increase the regulated NBN wholesale price by inflation plus 3% each year to 2040. And you might ask, well, why was that? Well, it's widely understood, Mr Speaker, the purpose of this staggering proposition was to lay the groundwork to maximise the future sale price of the NBN. So over a decade ago, the Liberals promised to deliver a third-rate copper NBN for $29 billion. Then it became $41 billion, then $49 billion, then $57 billion, a sushi train of incompetence and cost blowouts. In contrast, Mr Speaker, this government has delivered 2 budget surpluses. Our NBN upgrades are on time and on budget. The choice for Australians, especially in the regions, is crystal clear.
Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Is the Acting Prime Minister aware of a recent report from the Department of Energy in the US which shows that a renewables plus nuclear electricity grid is 37% cheaper than a renewables-only grid? What is it that experts in the US and 19 out of the 20 of the world's top economies know that the Acting Prime Minister does not know?
Order. The Acting Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, what they know is that in writing that report, they are assessing an economy which already has a civil nuclear industry in place, where the sunk costs have already been put in place literally decades ago. And this seems to be the fact that has completely escaped those opposite, that in order for us to get to a point of having a civil nuclear industry, we would need to go through the process of establishing it, which is deeply costly, which would take 20 years, and at the end of that we get 4% into our grid. That's it, 4%. And in the process we'll increase energy bills for households of Australia by $1,200. So that's what we understand, and that is not the same as the calculation which exists in the United States or the United Kingdom or France, where they all have a civil nuclear industry already established, and those costs have already been sunk and are not priced into the future. But the reality of what we face is you can't go out there and just magic the reactors. You've actually got to go and build them. That costs money, and the people who will pay for it are the Australian public.
The member for Fisher will cease interjecting. We'll hear from the honourable member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. How is the Albanese Labor government narrowing the digital divide in our regions, and what other approaches have been considered?
Call to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his question. He does such a cracking job advocating for the people of the Hunter, and we appreciate it. Like me, he knows the importance of reliable internet in our regional communities, because in 2024 reliable connectivity is no longer a nice-to-have, it's an absolute necessity, and that's why we're fixing the reckless and deliberate underinvestment from those opposite and making sure we keep the NBN in public hands. This means we can retain oversight on pricing, on infrastructure investment and, most importantly, on service quality, because the string and can approach doesn't work anymore. As part of our record investment, we're delivering $2.4 billion to expand full fibre internet access to 1.5 million premises across the nation, including 660,000 in our regions, providing uncapped data and faster speeds under Sky Muster, because you shouldn't be penalised because of your postcode. And I've driven around regional towns and communities now over the last few years, and you know what I haven't heard once? I haven't heard, let's make the NBN a little bit worse. Because that's what we've been talking about in the House today. We on this side of the House want to keep the NBN in public hands so that we can maintain control over service, over delivery, over quality. On this side of the House, we want to keep it in Australian hands for Australian people. Those opposite voted against that today because they want to sell it off to the lowest bidder. If the Leader of the Opposition ever stepped foot out of inner-city Brisbane, he would know that in the regions we need high-speed internet and we need to keep the NBN in public hands. I mean, hang on. I understand he went to the Shire of Collie in WA, snuck in the back door,
members on my left, the member for Cowper.
ran out in a tinted window car without speaking to a single worker or a regular person in the street. Regional communities like mine rely on NBN to work remotely, to access health and education services and to run our small businesses. It was the Labor government that established the NBN because we've always been committed to building Australia's future. During the disastrous decade those opposite had, they dismantled the NBN, and 15 minutes down the road in Jerrabombra, you don't have to go far to see why. Half the suburb had copper that dropped out every time there was heavy rain. Underinvestment is the MO of the Liberals. They are the party of privatisation and half-baked ideas. Don't take my word for it. The Mayor of Flinders Ranges said the first thing that goes under privatisation is service. And isn't that right? Like nuclear, they don't have a plan for connectivity other than selling the NBN. On this side of the House, we will back Australian communities right around the regions.
Call to the honourable member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Many Australians, particularly parents, support minimum age requirements to prevent under-16s accessing social media. But will social media platforms be able to demand and collect personal data, such as passports or driver's licences, from all existing or new account holders for age verification purposes? If not, how will age verification be obtained?
Call to the Minister for Communications.
I thank the member for her question and her interest in this issue. I know that this is a matter that is occupying the thoughts of so many Australian parents and members of the community now. It's one that is contentious. It's one that has not actually been implemented at scale anywhere in the world. The member asked a very important question about privacy, and I will respond in a few parts. The first is that the legislation that we will bring to this parliament will contain robust provisions as they pertain to privacy. We understand that Australians will be very concerned when they consider the level and the severity of cyber breaches that have happened in the recent past, and the need to ensure that, consistent with the principles of the Privacy Act, that there is only the collection and use of information for specific purposes, and we want to ensure through this legislation that that principle continues to be maintained. My clear answer for the member is that this is precisely why we are undertaking the age assurance trial, which we funded in the budget. Part of this goes to not only the effectiveness, and effectiveness goes to the willingness of platforms to utilise forms of age assurance, but also their acceptance by the public as well. We will use this time during the age assurance trial, and I would point out that the legislation will contain a one-year implementation timeframe to ensure that these matters, that are of concern are ones that are properly examined and properly accounted for. But I do want to make it clear to the member that there is a difference between age verification and age assurance. What we are seeking to do here through the trial is to understand these technologies which have been developing rapidly, and the obligation that will be placed on the social media platforms is to take those reasonable steps, reasonable efforts to ensure that people under the minimum age of 16 do not open and hold accounts. So this will be a process that we will go through implementation, working with eSafety, and I'm also working very closely with the Attorney-General and his department as well as the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner to get this right. But I do want to make this message very clear to the Australian people. This is not about government mandating any form of technology or demanding that any personal information be handed over to social media companies. I'm very pleased to continue to engage with the honourable member, as I'm sure she is keen to see results in this area as well.
Call to the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question's to the Acting Prime Minister. What is the significance of yesterday's meeting between our Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of India?
Call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the member for her question? Yesterday, Prime Minister Albanese met Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India in the sidelines of the G20 in Brazil. Our relationship with India has never been deeper or more important. India is now the biggest country in the world with rising living standards and a growing economy. And that is obviously fantastic for India, but it represents an enormous opportunity for Australia. And so yesterday, our two Prime Ministers announced that we will establish the India-Australia Renewable Energy Partnership, which will see an increase in two-way investment in renewable energy projects such as PV solar manufacturing, battery mineral processing, green hydrogen and green steel. Mr Speaker, we will also see a building of the renewable energy workforce of the future by our two countries establishing the India-Australia Solar Rooftop Academy. And that will be in India, and we will bring to bear our experience in training, our experience in rooftop solar by developing the curriculum and the program for this academy, which will see the training of 2,000 young Indians as solar PV technicians each and every year. In addition to our economic cooperation, our strategic alignment between Australia and India has never been greater, as our two nations watch the rules-based order be placed under increasing pressure in the region and the ocean that we share. And that has seen a growth in the defence engagement between our two countries. It has seen an increase in the tempo of our defence exercises. And so yesterday our Prime Ministers also announced that next year we will renew and we will update the 2009 Joint Declaration on Defence and Security Cooperation, and we will also establish a maritime collaboration security roadmap which will see us engage in more activity between our defence forces on maritime domain awareness activities throughout the Indo-Pacific. We cooperate on economic opportunity. We share strategic alignment. Mr Speaker, we also share passions, and that will be on display this Friday when our Test cricketing teams resume the contest for the Border Gavaskar Trophy. And in many ways it represents the biggest symbol of our history, of our friendship and of the enduring bonds which unite our two peoples.
Call to the member for Groom.
Hey, Speaker, my question is to the Acting Prime Minister. On Chris Yeoman's documentary on Sky News last night, US nuclear expert John Williams said, and quote, "Just about every continent has nuclear power except Australia. Why is the Albanese Labor government out of step with the rest of the world, which is increasingly taking up civil nuclear energy?"
Give the call. Order. 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 When the House comes to order, the Acting Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and we are very happy to receive the question from the honourable member, as we are very happy to stay on this topic all day and indeed every day between now and the next election. Because while it has missed the attention of those opposite that we don't have a civil nuclear industry in this country, that there isn't the sunk cost in place, which is what's enjoyed by those other countries which have a civil nuclear industry. While that fact may have been missed by those opposite, it has not been missed by the Australian people. And the Australian people understand that as the Leader of the Opposition pursues this ridiculous policy, that the only people who will end up paying for it is them. And they will pay for it through their energy household bills. And they will pay for it to the tune of $1,200 additional in respect of their household energy bills. That is why this government is not walking down the path of a civil nuclear industry, because this government has front and centre in its mind the cost of living challenges which are being faced by the Australian people. So every step that we take is going to be about putting downward pressure on the costs that they experience, which is so very, very different to what this Leader of the Opposition represents. Because be it what he did as the Health Minister, be it what he would do if he were ever given the chance to be the Prime Minister again, be it what is being proposed in terms of the policy in relation to the establishment of a civil nuclear industry in this country, what this Leader of the Opposition represents is a material and present risk to the household budgets of every single Australian.
Call to the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to lift bulk billing rates? Why is the government so committed to protecting Medicare after a decade of cuts and neglect? And what threats are there to bulk billing?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank the member for Bennelong and wish him a happy birthday. I'm sure there's no place he'd rather be than with 150 of his nearest and dearest friends on a day like this in question time. But the member has also been telling me, Mr Speaker, how well received the new urgent care clinic at Ryde has been by his community. Of course, Mr Speaker, I went to my trusty friend for validation, Google Review, which again is overflowing with similar comments. Visby said, very convenient and accessible. Jennifer said, the urgent care in Ryde is exceptional and a much-needed addition to the community. I could go on, Mr Speaker. This clinic is not just providing top-quality urgent care in a timely and convenient way, Mr Speaker. The important thing for the community is it's fully bulk billed. It's fully bulk billed, and that's also important for Labor, because for Labor, bulk billing has always been the beating heart of Medicare. But it's also always been hard fought, Mr Speaker. Initially with the doctors, when the AMA instructed their members not to bulk bill, but consistently through the years from the Liberal Party, Mr Speaker. Of course, John Howard called bulk billing an absolute rort. The Leader of the Opposition, when he was Health Minister, said there were too many free Medicare services and then tried to abolish bulk billing altogether, Mr Speaker. And that's the problem. And that's the problem throughout the years. This is not a one-off Liberal Party thought bubble. It's a long, unbroken thread of ideological opposition to Medicare and to bulk billing in particular, Mr Speaker. And most recently, the Deputy Liberal leaders interjecting, of course. Most recently, you just have to look at the Deputy Liberal leader's comments this week, when she said it is a key Liberal Party principle. If you don't pay for something, you don't value it, Mr Speaker. That's what she said. And maybe that's why, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition tried to make every Australian pay a fee when they got rushed to the local emergency department, because apparently Australians won't value having their life saved when they're having a heart attack unless they hand a fee over to the Leader of the Opposition. Apparently that's why they oppose bulk billing as well, because people don't value free access to a GP unless they get to pay a fee to the Leader of the Opposition. Well, we have a different view, Mr Speaker. The reason our healthcare system is consistently voted #1 in the world, especially for health equity, Mr Speaker, is our free public hospitals and bulk billing in Medicare, Mr Speaker. So every Australian can access the best healthcare in the world just by bringing this beautiful little green card, Mr Speaker, confident they can keep their credit card at home. Now, the Liberal Party might not value this, but most Australians value it, and I can tell you the Labor Party values it too.
Call to the acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The member for Hume has indicated that he is seeking the call for misrepresentation.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to make a personal explanation.
Do you claim to be misrepresented?
I do, most agreeably.
You may proceed.
Yesterday in question time, the Minister for Health made some incorrect comments or made an incorrect claim about the comments I made on radio regarding health. They were not only completely false, they were so bizarre I am actually worried the minister might be hallucinating. Now, what the minister might want to know about what I said was Australians can't afford to pay for heating or air conditioning, can't afford to pay for our health. Australians are struggling to pay the mortgage, to pay the rent. Younger Australians can't get into a home. It all starts piling up. Because the truth is, Mr Speaker, Australians are poorer under Labor.
Pursuant to the National Anti-Corruption Commission Act 2022, I present the annual report for 2023-2024 of the Inspector of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. I also present the Auditor-General's Performance Audit Report No. 14 of 2024 to 2025, entitled Implementation of Parliamentary Committee and Auditor-General Recommendations, Indigenous Affairs Portfolio, Indigenous Business Australia, National Indigenous Australians Agency. Call the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, this document is tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. The full details of the document will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.